Hello and warm welcome to everybody today. And thank you so much for joining us on this interesting session covering the topic, creating the blueprint for a sustainable, resilient post-COVID recovery. My name is Diana Reeves. I'm working with Cabot Capital Partners, and you can find out more about me if you connect on LinkedIn or otherwise message me on this platform. And the warmest of welcomes to our brilliant panelists this morning. I'll give them a brief introduction and you'll hear more about them as we go along. We have Marita Alishabana, who is the Chief Risk Officer of the recently established Indonesia Investment Authority. The authority focuses on investment in Indonesia and catalyzing foreign direct capital to add to those projects. Marita focuses on risk management, compliance, and ESG. Additionally, we have James Chiao, who is the Chief Investment Officer of HSBC in Asia. He is spending the bulk of his time working towards ensuring HSBC becomes a net zero bank, supporting their customers in their transition to net zero and unlocking the next generation of climate solutions. And last but by no means least, we have Kim Farrant, who is the General Manager for Responsible Investment at Hester. Hester is a large, diversified Australian asset owner focused on impact delivered through its investment strategy, advocacy, and corporate responsibility. It was the first major fund in Australia to announce its net zero commitment. Kim focuses on system-level risk, which incorporates the ecosystem in addition to company and asset-level risk, and engages in a number of initiatives which we will hear more about later. So, sustainability. The context to this conversation is the recent climate change report issued by the Intergovernment Panel, which highlighted the need to get ourselves back on track. The report was a fire alarm for the planet and emphasized the need for collaborative action, interconnection between the different pillars of ESG, and the need to address the increased issues arising from the pandemic. So this discussion this morning will give you a sense of the engagement and activity which centers on sustainability in our region. So without further ado, if I can start with you, James, could you give us an outline of what sustainability looks like for HSBC and how that view has evolved over the course of the pandemic?
Well, thanks for that question. And I think for us, sustainability encompasses our as a steward of finance and capital towards how we could bring the world into a net zero world of sorts. And also there are various dimensions to it. There is the environmental dimension. There is also a social as well as a governance aspects to bring every of all these components together. And I think what we want to do at HSBC is to become a net zero bank, but not just for ourselves, but for all our customers and of course alongside all its value chain. And I think that's going to be a big ambition to get it down by 2050, aligned with the Paris Agreement. Because bear in mind that the situation, as highlighted by the IPCC report, is very stark, that we need to more than halve our greenhouse emission as a planet by the next decade or so. And I think that's going to be huge amount of work and effort to bring about this whole transition. And then what's crucial also is as a bank, we have that role and as capital providers to make that transition. So I think we are going and we are setting out various clear and measurable pathways to net zero. We are also making quite a bit of regular and transparent disclosure to communicate our progress, especially on climate-related financial disclosure, not just for ourselves, but also to help our stakeholders and customers along this whole transition. And of course, with many government authorities as well as many partners, we are helping to bring about this whole transition And of course, we have set out our own ambition to be net zero by 2030 or sooner. So there is a lot of work and a lot of things at stake, but I think we are moving in the right direction.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. So lots of activity on multiple fronts, engagement across the ecosystem, and particularly within the bank and your customer population. Kim, do you have anything to add to that from Hester's perspective?
Thanks, Diana. I think in terms of climate action, we use many of the same frameworks as HSBC. Hester, as you mentioned, was the first major super fund in Australia to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. And we've been certified as carbon neutral by the Australian government for our operations for a number of years. And then last year, we used the TCFD framework to communicate our climate change transition plan. But for Hester, sustainability is about seeking to have a positive impact on people and the planet. It isn't something that's just limited to our investments or to our operations. Hester Impact is about investing for purpose, advocating with influence, and leading by example. And for the investment team, our objective is to deliver investment excellence with impact. Because the investment decisions that we make and the actions that we take obviously have an impact on the world, not just on our investment portfolio and fund. Now, our strategy essentially focuses on that investment excellence with impact because we recognise the need to understand, measure and manage those impacts. And we find that the Sustainable Development Goals provide a framework to measure that impact on the world, which I'm happy to talk about more later. So essentially, we seek to create a positive impact in the area of some priority thematics, which are aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great. Thank you. And Marita, I know it's early days for the Indonesian Investment Authority, but already you've made your presence known in the region and of course in Indonesia. How have you set the pathway for your sustainability activities, and how might the pandemic have geared or influenced their emphasis in the short term? Marita, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Well, INA, the Indonesian Investment Authority, which was just established a year ago, was actually established during the pandemic. So we have a pretty clean slate to start with. And as a sovereign wealth fund, we have very long-term perspective. So we really, it's crucial for us to ensure that our investment and operational processes, are done responsibly in terms of environmental, social, governance, and long-term sustainability. So and the pandemic really, us being born in the middle of the pandemic just 1 year ago, has really been a wake-up call for everyone. And the G20, which is now in Indonesia this year, it's the top of everyone's mind. It's really an important thing that everyone is looking at. And this past year, we have integrated ESG into our investment process. The policies have been put in place on ESG. So starting from screening to due diligence, we have the ESG metrics as a framework, guidelines for identifying the risks, the opportunities to relate with ESG, and in order to create, value added for our investments. We also have a roadmap to engage closely with our potential investee companies to achieve the best practices for ESG. So basically, that's the framework we've put in place.
Great, thank you. So there's absolutely no doubt everybody understands what sustainability is. There's a huge amount of engagement, both within your own organizations and reaching out across the ecosystem as influencers and advocates. How the complexity of the whole activity around sustainability cannot be understated. And as financial institutions and financial participants, there are various priorities that need to be balanced within any particular strategy. So, Kim, can you just talk a little bit about how you weigh the need to achieve a financial return with societal considerations and climate-friendly activity?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. As you mentioned before, I mean, the pandemic essentially has revealed and sort of worsened inequalities. For us, it's very much emphasised the systemic nature of many of the risks that we face in managing the investment portfolio. So those systemic risks essentially have the potential to impact the market fundamentals that drive investment returns, and therefore impact the retirement savings of our members. So we've recognised sort of climate change as a systemic risk for many years, but increasingly we're recognising a broader range of factors that provide the foundation for market stability. So factors like gender equality, decent work, health and well-being support strong market fundamentals, while systemic risks like climate change have the potential to undermine these. And it's therefore sort of in our members' best interest to take action which supports strong and stable markets. In terms of sort of E, S and G issues, we don't see them fitting into nice separate boxes. Essentially, these issues we consider are system level issues. They're complex and they're intersecting sort of environmental, social and governance considerations. And that is one of the reasons that we believe it's important to measure impact. And that's something that we've been progressing significantly within our strategy this year. Essentially, we're looking to bring together those environmental, social and governance pieces into a single measure of real world impact. So what we're currently doing is we're working to measure portfolio impact through a pilot with the Harvard Impact weighted accounting methodology. So IWA, as it's termed, essentially provides an open source methodology for quantifying sort of the three pillars of company impact. And those are sort of environment, workforce and product impact. And essentially it measures and incorporates the broader positive and negative impacts of a company, which might ordinarily be seen as externalities, and then essentially monetizes these in terms of dollar value for ease of comparison and scalability. So it enables us to bring together those environmental, social and governance factors. Absolutely, sort of as an Australian superannuation fund, we have a duty to act in the best financial interests of our members, but we believe that responsible investment is entirely consistent with that obligation because the factors that we consider, they're financially material to the performance either of the specific company that we're looking at or to the system level fundamentals which support our ability to deliver that ongoing strong financial returns to our members. So by the end of the year, we're hoping to have scaled up the pilot that we're currently running and to be able to assess how this approach in terms of impact weighted accounts can be leveraged to develop, deliver investment insights to our analysts, to support both manager and company engagement and to measure ESG risk as well as support our member communications.
Thank you. That's a fantastic initiative, and hopefully it will keep everybody on a more informed path, because there's no point in a retirement, particularly if you reach it in ill health and unable to enjoy the fantastic views that we have done. Marita, as a sovereign wealth fund, I would imagine that there's an additional layer of consideration that goes into the strategy around sustainability. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes, INA's ESG metrics, basically, or ESG framework, like Kim said earlier, we don't put them in different boxes, but the E, S, and G pillars are in all of them. And every investment that we do have to go through all of these, the E, S, and the G. And the agreements when we acquire these investments, and then the reporting, and then the follow-up, and the roadmap covers all three of them. So we take these ESG considerations also in selecting the thematic investments or funds, and then to balance our portfolio, because of course some of our portfolio will be in, for instance, more generic industries, toll roads and things like that. But we balance our portfolio, and we're actively looking into also the ESG impactful, such as green funds or social fintech funds that will address these in a more impactful way specifically. Now, our midterm and goal and action plans is really to continue to incorporate our ESG into our investments as we slowly move to, well, not slowly, hopefully quickly, move to make more and more investments into our investment and also into our operational processes, and diversify our portfolio to include more impactful ESG investments while taking care of the whole portfolio to address these ESG issues.
Great, thank you. And James, do you have something to add? I'm sure you do.
Well, I think for us at HSBC, we are supporting our customers through this whole transition. And of course, HSBC is a universal bank. So other than providing credit and capital to companies, we are also asset manager as well as investment advisors as well. So it's the whole spectrum of activity bringing about this whole transition for all our customers. And I think that's the journey that we are going to take with everyone. It is going to be a challenging journey ahead. It's not easy. Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions to reduce certain relationships. But also, I think what we want to do is also to recognize that climate change is not just a threat for the planet, but it could be an opportunity. And in fact, one of the largest opportunity, especially if the world or the global economy transits into this green economy, you will require almost $100 trillion of investments over the next decade to make this whole transition possible. And we want to be there to finance this transition. And I think that's where we want to be at this stage. And of course, it's not going to be easy. But I think as we put our efforts together, we can actually help in this whole decarbonization effort that has already kick-started across the world.
Thank you. And then just we're talking about also balancing various different stakeholders. See, investors have been the traditional group focused on, and now that has been expanded to accommodate stakeholders, which include the natural world, in addition to the communities in which the businesses funded by institutions operate. Marita, could you add a little bit around how you balance specifically the role of the Sovereign Wealth Fund in generating financial returns and meeting the social economic priorities of Indonesia?
Yeah, INA, or the Indonesian Investment Authority's mandate, basically covers two things. And the first one is really, of course, to obtain optimal risk-adjusted returns and attract investment, foreign investment mainly. And the second one is really to contribute to Indonesia's growth in a sustainable way, sustainably. So these can sometimes be contradictory because, of course, development goals or ESG goals as well may yield lower returns. So there can be push and pull among stakeholders about where they want to put their money. So this is something that's ongoing that we actually face every day when we look at potential deals, when we negotiate, and it is something that really we need to look at in a very balanced way, because we understand that our portfolio has to really address both these issues. And so the sectors that we look at will very much be developmental, or they would be ESG related, impactful, but ensuring that our portfolio is balanced sustainably and adhering to our principle of being commercial and being able to attract other investors has to be in place. So we keep balancing those two things, and it's something that's an ongoing thing that we do all the time. So those are two very important things that we balance all the time, and we actively discuss also with our stakeholders who understand also from both points of view. And so that's basically how we're moving forward. And it seems to be actually a very good combination. For the transition, we have actively been talking with the government, or let's say especially with PLN, which is the state-owned enterprise for electricity, the state-owned electricity company. Basically, we've been actively discussing, because we have been asked to investigate on the energy transmission mechanism in order to accomplish, Indonesia's NDCs and net zero commitment. And this, of course, involves multiple stakeholders with varying interests. Now, in this, for instance, PLN, the state electricity company, requires that there are separate tenders for coal-fired power plants decommissioning, and for renewable energy, they have to be separate. While in talking to investors, we've discovered that investors are really often less willing to look at only decommissioning coal-fired power plants. And a bundling would actually be the best solution. And we have actually suggested this because based on INA's status as a sui generis, and in our articles, we are able to be actually directly appointed, and we could do such a bundling. So that's something that we are looking, and we're discussing whether there's an opportunity for us to help in that way and act as a bridge. So in terms of the way that we operate, it's not only in terms of co-investment and attracting foreign investments, but we look to be a solution in terms of, arranging solutions. For instance, in this case, that we can maybe bundle these two things, and then also we can, because of our close proximity to the government, have input on the policies and so on. So that is really how we are working to bring together all our different stakeholders. That's just an example.
Great, thank you. And James, HSBC is obviously an entrenched institution. It's been around for many decades. Clearly, you have existing clients who are in the midst of transition under the guidance of HSBC. How do you manage those parts of the legacy portfolio that are engaged in the sectors which are falling out of favour because of their sustainability challenges? Shall we cover fossil fuel? So that's the one usually at the tip of everybody's tongue.
Yeah, well, great question. I think first and foremost, we have set out very ambitious carbon reduction targets, but that's setting out, and we want to measure it, and we want to move along that direction. But along which, I think what's very important is that of course, we want to prioritize financing and capital to technology, to sectors that could bring about this whole green transition faster. But of course, you have stranded assets at the same time, particularly those in whether it's coal, thermal coal, energy generation, or even fossil fuel. But I think we want to be part of the solution, and we want to partner this parts of our customers along their journey on this transition. And I think that's how we approach it, rather than to avoid it altogether. We have set out targets on our reduction towards these sectors. These are ambitious targets, but I think we want to partner them along this journey. And I think many of our stakeholders have realized that they have to also make their own transition, particularly those in these sectors. And a lot of them are also pushing ahead with how do they reduce carbon, or how do they move into renewable energy, for example, or how do they introduce new technologies such as green hydrogen or carbon capture. And I think that's where our financing is, to partner with them in bringing about this transition. So I think there are many commonalities right now in that we all see that this transition is necessary. Some companies will, based on the setup and the DNA of the company, would be easier for them to make the transition. Some would take a slower time. But I think what's important is we partner them on this journey towards the right direction. And I think that's where we want to head in the years and decades ahead to reach net zero by 2050.
That's great, and you know, I think certainly given the implicit know-how in many of the companies that have engaged in these activities over a number of years, finding a way to harness that and continue to leverage it into a sustainable future is the most productive way to go, and particularly where there has been a willingness expressed to do so, and engagement with targets that meet the requirements of the wider world. Kim, how does HESTA approach these industries in transition?
As I mentioned before, sort of essentially HESTA is a universal owner. We're large enough and we're diversified enough that we essentially own a slice of the market. And so in that context, different parts of our portfolio will clearly be impacted by different risks and opportunities in terms of sort of climate change. And at the opportunity end of the spectrum, climate change obviously does present an opportunity to invest in companies that will benefit from the transition. And HESTA does have more than $600 million or almost 1% of the portfolio invested in unlisted sort of climate solution assets. So these investments include renewable energy assets like the Snowtown 2 wind farm in South Australia, Zelio and the Ross River solar farm, as well as private equity investments, including groups like electric vehicle companies like Gogoro. But as we said, we can't just focus on the opportunities and we can't just focus on the risks. We've got to have an approach that is differentiated across the different risks that apply to our portfolio. So there obviously are companies for which climate transition presents a risk, and we essentially break these into two groups: those at risk of stranding and those with the ability to transition. And when we consider the likelihood of a company or group of companies, I suppose, likelihood of becoming stranded, essentially we consider factors including the risk of negative revaluation due to policy changes or technical disruption. We consider the relative emissions intensity of an asset or company, its relative extraction costs, its social license, and whether engagement has been effective in the past. And then based upon those factors, we do actually already have in place a thermal coal exclusion. But in terms of the broader fossil fuel sector, we believe that it's in our members' best financial interest to support the transition of these companies through active engagement. So we conduct this engagement both directly with the boards and the executive of companies, as well as through collaborative initiatives like Climate Action 100+ and through service providers. So for those companies that are exposed to the greatest transition risk, essentially we're seeking to regularly update our assessment of each company's transition plan and to set and communicate milestones for action. While we've already got a track record of having supported a range of climate-related shareholder resolutions, as well as having voted against director re-election on climate grounds, I think we can expect companies can expect to see more of this from asset owners going into the future. But I also think there's cause for optimism. I think within these transition risk exposed companies, over the last couple of years, we've seen net zero commitments made, we've seen climate transition plans developed, and we're seeing increasingly strong levels of capital allocation towards growth opportunities such as green hydrogen. So really, as asset owners and as investors, essentially now our role is to sort of keenly monitor the progress of those companies against their climate change transition plans.
Great, thank you. So again, a comprehensive range of activity and involvement which extends beyond being a pure investor in the traditional sense. I just want to jump quickly to some of the questions, which are bringing out the more socially oriented considerations needed to build this resilience and sustainability going forward. Marita, there's a question around how or whether you are involved in the education field, bringing forward the next generation and the younger workforce into the concept of sustainability. Do you see a role for the authority in promulgating education around the subject, in addition to, through your investments, and ensuring the investees engage appropriately?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting, actually, a very attractive prospect. At the moment, we've only been around for a year. So as a government, as the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think the assets that we have been asked to look at the beginning are the very developmental ones, such as toll roads, airports, seaports. But we're also looking, other than that, at, for instance, establishing a green fund or a fintech, and looking at the social aspects of trying to provide financing to the unbankable. So we are looking at that. At this point in time, which is very early still, education, we have not yet explored that opportunity, but it's definitely something that we would look to take an interest in, because it is one of the development aspects of Indonesia. So at this point in time, we haven't yet had that chance to do that, but definitely going forward, it's something that would be of interest.
Great. And just moving to the opposite end of the population spectrum, Kim, do you in the impact area of investment, do you use a lens which enables inclusiveness of the older generation, engaging them in the workforce to a certain extent, bringing their skills forward in the technology sense, and in terms of the new way of undertaking business?
So HESTA has quite a diversified membership, but a lot of our members work in health and community services. So when I think about our typical member, 80% of them are women, and they typically work as an aged care professional, in early childhood care, or as nurses. And so a lot of them are working in those caring economies that affect both our younger people, sort of, as well as those who are in retirement. And so a lot of our impact program does focus on those areas that our members work in as well. And so we have supported significantly both social and affordable housing for our members, and for people like our members who work in those key sectors and who might ordinarily struggle to find sort of accommodation close to major cities that enables them to provide those very important roles. We also support sort of our members and have provided sort of support in terms of education to early childhood care professionals to talk about sort of sustainability and to provide them with resources for that education. And then at the older end of the spectrum, sort of, certainly we do aim to very much, I suppose, support all of our members in their retirement, but we do find that a lot of those members I suppose, who are in that retirement stage are very engaged on these issues as well.
Great, thank you. And I hope that those address the questions around engaging across the age spectrum of populations. James, I think this one might be for you, but please, Kim and Marita, add on. It's unequivocal what the general direction needs to be if we want future generations to enjoy the same privileges of the planet that we have and past generations have. However, how do you adjust to keep on course in the midst of huge uncertainty? Obviously, the last 3 years have been challenging because of the pandemic. Immediately and currently, there is a situation in Europe which is creating significant volatility around certain commodities and areas. How do you accommodate and mitigate short-term uncertainties and still ensure the medium-term direction is maintained? James, you're on mute. James, you're on mute.
Yeah. Great question. In fact, my view is that the pandemic has actually brought the world together to focus on climate change, which is actually a bigger threat than the pandemic. It is probably something that's slower burning, but the impact is actually much greater. And I think pandemic has that way that brings the world together. We see that especially in recent alliances across the financial institutions to come together, but also in terms of the pledges by governments in going net zero. And I think the pandemic has that trigger that brought the world together to make about this change. The direction is right, but of course, there's still many challenges ahead. And of course, with the recent increase in commodity and energy price, what it shows is that the energy transition from fossil fuel into renewable energy has to be accelerated. And I think that's clear. And the price of commodities right now is signaling that transition. I think, and of course, Europe will take the lead in this whole transition right now because most of the price increase is felt there. So I think that's going to be all these events have actually sort of accelerated the transition rather than slow it down. And I think that's the hope. And I believe that that's going to be the direction in the years ahead.
Great, thank you. And a dimension to this question is also the risk that if there isn't sufficient attention paid to the social dimension of ESG, that in itself can produce more volatility in the prospect of social unrest. So Kim, would you have any views on that dimension, not to leave people behind?
Absolutely. And I think pretty much only one of the certainties these days is that things are constantly changing. And I would echo a lot of James's comments that I think the pandemic has brought a lot of what were traditionally seen as long-term risks into this sort of the short to medium term. These risks have become sort of front and center for people, and climate change has moved from being something that has been seen long term and that the effects would be seen over time to something that needs to be addressed now. I think increasingly we're seeing that we need to consider a much broader range of risks as well. Certainly, I think a lot of funds are starting to think about sort of a broader range of geopolitical risks and how do you mitigate for and think about sort of managing the portfolio for those different range of different risks. And certainly social risks need to be a big part of that. As I mentioned before, sort of with our members working in health and community services sectors, we believe that sort of support of that health and community services does provide a significant opportunity to sort of catalyse a strong recovery from the COVID sort of pandemic.
Thank you for that. Marita, do you have a quick comment to add? I mean, long-term view, but short-term adjustment for uncertainty?
Well, really, INA as the Indonesian Sovereign Wealth Fund and Indonesia as a developing country, the social aspect is very important. And I think one of the reasons we were established is really to bring in investment into Indonesia, which would help the economy of Indonesia, which, however you look at it, is a way for us to improve the social and economic standing of the people here. And there's a lot of social and economic issues, of course, in Indonesia as a developing country. And I think the assets we've been looking at, definitely we have, of course, been looking at the very generic ones such as toll roads and so, which would help the overall economy. But we've also been looking at funds that we're looking to establish, and that would go into things such as fishery companies that would help fishermen, fintech for the unbankable, like I mentioned. We're looking at healthcare, hospitals. So I think INA in itself, with our developmental role, really addresses, helps, is one of the reasons actually to help to address also this in Indonesia.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. So if there's any quick questions any of the audience wish to pose, please do so quickly. And I can't guarantee, but I will try to field them for you. Just briefly, I think we've been given a wonderful array of insight and information about the various activities and initiatives and thinking and strategy around sustainability, resilience and recovery in the region. If I were to ask each of you to just highlight one initiative which you think characterizes, in a single bucket, your organization's approach to sustainability, which one would you like to highlight to the audience in 30 seconds? So if I can perhaps target Kim first.
Thank you. It's a bit of a choice, but I would like to sort of talk about the work that we've done around gender equality, because I think it is perhaps different than some of the other work that we've been involved with, collaborative initiatives on climate and issues like modern slavery. So as I mentioned, 80% of HESTA's members are women, many of whom work in health and community services. And we recognise and I recognise that research shows that diversity in leadership results in improved decision-making as well as better long-term value and performance for shareholders. And essentially that's the reason that we decided to develop an initiative called 40/40 Vision, which is an investor-led initiative founded by HESTA and supported by industry partners, including asset owners and investment managers, which seeks to achieve gender-balanced executive teams within ASX 300 companies by 2030. So at the moment, the initiative represents just over 6.4 trillion Australian dollars of assets under management, and we've seen almost 25% of ASX 200 market capitalisation sign up to the commitment. And essentially, the initiative requires that companies set and work towards a 2030 objective of having 40% men, 40% women, and 20% of any gender within their executive teams. And we believe that this program is driving enhanced gender equality, certainly within the Australian market.
Great. And James, just quickly.
We want to become a net zero bank, and in order to do that, we have to support all our customers to thrive through this whole net zero transition. It's a journey, and I think it's challenging, but of course we want to unlock the future potential and the next generation climate solutions, and I think that's where the excitement is in the years ahead.
Brilliant, great. And Marita, just quickly, I know you're new in and of yourself. The authority is a fantastic initiative.
Yeah, I think as a very new organization, I think the most important initiative really has been that right from the beginning, right from day one, we put down that ESG is one of the principles of our investing, and within this first year was one of the first policies that we put in place on how to do ESG, what it means to ENI, and how we will be moving forward with it, and also having internally just socializing it with all of our employees. And in our investment committees, we have a special team that really looks at ESG related investments to make sure that there's a balance in our portfolio, besides doing the normal the ESG due diligence on the generic industries that we're looking at. So I think going forward, it's very positive for ENI on the ESG side.
Great, thank you. Well, we're down to a minute. There's no more questions. I just want to thank you all for participating today and being so open in sharing with us everything that is being done. I think hopefully, audience, you have a great sense of the variety across the region. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.